Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at education in Elizabeth's England. Like so many other things in Elizabeth's England, an awful lot depended on the social hierarchy. Elizabethan education wasn't about social mobility or social climbing or improving yourself. It was about preparing to live the life that was already expected of you. Taking the social hierarchy of towns into account, here are some examples that might apply to boys. At the top of this hierarchy are the merchants. They might be educated and literate, but they focused on arithmetic and geography, which would help with their trade, rather than Latin scripture. Then next up, we've got the professionals. They might learn the specifics for their specialisms, such as law or medicine. Then we've got business owners. They might have basic literacy and arithmetic, things that would help them with their businesses. Then we've got the skilled craftsmen. They would learn a trade, often through a long apprenticeship, but they wouldn't necessarily be literate. And then we've got the majority, the unskilled workers and the unemployed. They had little need for literacy or wider learning. Few had any education whatsoever. But let's consider what sort of education was available. Firstly, we've got to understand the impact of religion on all this. Protestantism was the driver of change in education in Elizabeth's England. In Catholicism, a worshipper's relationship with God was managed by the priesthood, and the Latin Bible was only readable by a literate elite of clergy. However, Protestantism favoured a Bible in English, with worshippers able to read it, interpret it, and develop their own relationship with God. This encouraged better-off Protestants to become literate, and it challenged the traditional religious thinking. So how did they get this literacy? Who actually went to school? What kind of school a child attended all depended on their age, their gender, and their social status, as we mentioned earlier. At the bottom, lower class boys and girls had no schooling at all. They could neither afford it, nor did they need it with their work and lifestyle. But then middle class girls may have attended what was known as a dame school, more on that later on. Middle class boys might have attended a petty school, aged between about 4 and 8. But then some of them would have proceeded onto a grammar school between the ages of about 8 and 14. And then a few would have gone to university, usually on an apprenticeship, as middle class boys probably wouldn't have been able to afford it and do a degree. Noble girls had a private tutor until the age of about 13 to 15, teaching them the basics of court life. Most then had some education within the household, but then it stopped. Noble boys, on the other hand, had a private tutor until they were aged about 13 to 15. After that, they were then educated within the household, and then some of those might go on to university to specialise in particular areas and perhaps do a degree, much as people do today. So you can see that the arrows get smaller as things go on, as fewer people take their education to that level. Let's consider how the nobility were educated. Firstly, girls. As Elizabeth was highly educated, many noble parents followed her example and valued educating their daughters, not just their sons. Knowledge taught included Latin and Greek, as in the ancient languages, history, philosophy, government, and theology, the study of religion, which at this time would have been Christianity. Skills included music, dance, needlework, horse riding, and archery. They would also learn how to behave in court society. Boys had a different education. Early on, they learned similar knowledge to girls, but from about the age of 7, they were educated separately. Boys also learned horse riding and archery, but then also learned other so-called male-appropriate topics of study, which included fencing, swimming, wrestling, and sports. As boys might expect to inherit their father's title, they also learned how to be a nobleman and how to behave at court, build contacts, and govern. This might be done with another noble household. Middling sorts, or the middle classes, tended to go to a grammar school. More than 70 grammar schools were founded from the 1560s to the 1570s. Prior to the Reformation, only the church provided whatever education children could get. Grammar schools were private, so only those who could afford the fees attended. Often these varied depending on how much land the boy's family owned. And yes, that's right, boys, not girls. Most were in towns and so attracted members of the gentry, professionals, and wealthy business owners. Some lower class boys might attend, but this relied on charity. Paid scholarships for poor children who showed promise might make up part of a rich person's will. The focus of grammar school education was Latin grammar, that's why they're called grammar schools, with Bible texts containing moral lessons most often memorised. However, other languages might be learned alongside history and philosophy from ancient writers like Plato or Aristotle. Skills taught included horse riding, archery and running for fitness. Chess and debating were also valued for stretching strategic and analytical thinking. Now there's quite a lot of text on this screen. You might want to pause it, make sure it's full screen and perhaps take a screenshot for later. Let's consider a typical grammar school day. I don't think you would want to trade places with an Elizabethan schoolchild. Days were long and discipline was strict. Boys attended school from Monday to Friday with some additional study on Saturdays too. Holidays were short, typically only Christmas and Easter. A typical school day might be as follows. Starting nice and early at 6 a.m, where the activity was church for morning prayers, a little bit like a modern day assembly. Then at 7 a.m, there would be a recitation of the previous day's learning. Recite basically means to speak again, so they'd be just recalling whatever they had done the day before. Then at 7:30 they would have their breakfast. Yep, all those first things would have been done on an empty stomach. At 8 a.m. there would be translation, usually that meant Latin into English. At 9 a.m. there would be classics. This would be studying historians and philosophers of the ancient world, poetry or literature. Then at 11 a.m. there would be dinner. At 12 a.m. there would be questions on the day's learning so far. Homework would be marked. At 1 p.m. more translation or acting out classical plays, which perhaps doesn't sound quite so bad. Then at 3:30 p.m. there would be an afternoon break, because they're still not done yet. Yes, that's right, when you're usually on the bus home, they would still be doing Latin grammar. And at 5 p.m, finally, the school day would finish. Quite a lot to fit in. But remember, education was a privilege for the wealthy elites, and for the middling sorts who could afford it. It wouldn't have been for everybody. As mentioned already, grammar school discipline could be very strict. By modern standards, discipline was strict and reflected the beliefs of the time. However, some aspects may seem familiar, and punishments were given out for many of the same behaviours that children exhibit at school today. Losing break time was a pretty common punishment. This might be for minor offences like talking over the teacher. Temporary exclusion might also be used. This would be for more serious cases like stealing or fighting, and would involve a meeting with the parents. Being on report was also something that was done. Persistent offenders might be monitored by staff and have their reports given to their parents. Let's be honest, most of this stuff would be pretty familiar in a modern day school, but this is where it starts to change. Corporal punishment. For a short, sharp shock, pupils would be beaten, including with a cane or rod. But then there would be permanent expulsion. The most serious offences, or repeat offenders, would be expelled permanently. Grammar schools relied on pupil fees, so this was a real last resort, as it would impact the grammar school too. And it would have to follow many warnings to both the pupil and parents. So some of these things would seem really familiar to us, others not so much. However, we need to look at this relatively as well. You'd probably get much harsher punishments for things that today would be seen as very minor bits of misbehaviour indeed. What about schooling for other boys? Schooling was not compulsory, and boys would only attend if their parents could afford it, valued it, and could do without their help at home or in the business. Merchants and craftsmen might attend grammar school to learn more practical subjects for their position in society, for example, geography, English, writing, arithmetic, that sort of thing that would help a merchant communicate and run his business. Skilled craftsmen and yeomen would likewise learn skills relevant to running their farms and businesses. This often took the form of an apprenticeship, but would also include some literacy and numeracy skills too. Then there are petty schools and dame schools, which would include some education for girls. A teacher might offer to run a petty school in their own home. Younger boys might learn the basics of reading, writing and arithmetic at these schools from about the age of 4 to the age of 8, when they would attend the grammar school if they could afford it. Discipline would often be instant and physical. In other words, if you stepped out of line, the teacher would just hit you. And beatings and canings were common. Girls might attend a dame school run by an educated woman or dame. While some reading might be taught, this was focused on running the household. Domestic skills of sewing, baking, brewing ale and the basic home medicine were taught. Like all Elizabethan schooling, the dame schools intended to prepare girls for their expected role in society, which in this case was usually being a housewife. At a higher level, we've got the universities. The nobility and graduates of the grammar schools might attend a university. In Elizabethan times, this meant attending either Oxford or Cambridge, at which there were many separate colleges and specialisms. Jesus College, Oxford, which is pictured at the bottom there, was established by Elizabeth herself in 1571, and Privy Councillor Sir Walter Mildmay established Emmanuel College, Cambridge. The Elizabethan settlement had shown a shortage of trained Protestant bishops, and the new colleges hoped to address this through divinity and theology studies. University education began at the age of about 14 or 15, quite a bit younger than today, where people normally start university at 18 or older. Degrees in geometry, music, astronomy, philosophy, logic, rhetoric, so that's the art of speaking, were taught. Further study might earn a doctorate in medicine, law, or divinity. Law students might attend one of the London Inns of Court instead of Oxford or Cambridge. These were, as the name suggests, established in London, within the old city of London, for example, the Lincoln's Inn. What was the impact of education? It is easy to exaggerate Elizabethan education or accidentally apply our modern attitudes to the time. However, literacy rates for men in the end of Elizabeth's reign were about 30%. This was 10% higher than the figure had been in the 1530s in the reign of Henry VIII. However, there was no improvement in literacy rates for girls, suggesting the importance of educating girls had not really improved. Elizabethan schooling was modelled around preparing people for their expected roles in society, and only the wealthy could afford it. By this logic, poor children who did not get the opportunity just went without. Rich boys might get the education to do well in their trade or business, allowing them more to support their family though. Richer women might only need to marry well and manage the home, so if a family could only afford to educate one child, they tended to choose sons over daughters. Our final points then. Schooling in Elizabethan England sought to prepare people for their roles in society, not provide them with social mobility. Children of the nobility tended to be educated in the household by private tutors before going to university. Middle-class boys might go to a petty school, then a grammar school, and then possibly to a university, possibly on a scholarship. Middle-class girls might attend a dame school, that's if they went to school at all. The Protestant Reformation allowed people to study the Bible for themselves. This served to encourage literacy. Finally, educational progress was not even. While male literacy increased from about 20% to 30% between the reign of Henry VIII and the end of Elizabeth's reign, there was little to no change for women. Speaking about learning things, hopefully you got everything that you needed from this video, and if you did, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Other than that, thanks very much for paying attention, and I'm glad there's been no need to deal out any corporal punishment in this video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.